Great. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here today to be able to moderate this session. What about books? When Simon and Manisha originally reached out, I was tremendously excited, and thankfully we were able to put together a wonderful session today. I'm Heather Staines, Senior Consultant at Delta Think and Director of Community Engagement for our Open Access Data and Analytics tool. And I will be moderating today. I'm joined by the session co-chair, Jennifer Regala, Director of Publications and Executive Editor at American Urological Association. Driving our slides, I'm very grateful for Chloe Duchesne, Educational Services Coordinator at Copyright Clearance Center, and our three fantastic speakers, John Shearer, University of North Carolina Press, he's the director there, Martin Paul Eve, Professor of Literature, Technology, and Publishing at Birkbeck College, University of London, and Sarah Lynch, who's Assistant Publisher at the IET. Before we hand over to our speakers who are going to start to kick off with just a couple of slides each to set the stage, I wanted to give you a little bit of an information on how we have organized the session. We thought about the flow of books within publishing house and sending out in the world. So we're going to break up our conversation into sort of four parts. The first part being questions between editors and authors, at that early stage. Second, the creation of the book, the formatting stage. Third, the dissemination stage, both for print and online books. And finally, the consumption stage, the user and reader and some of the things that impact discoverability there. So as we move through those different stages, please feel free to ask a question, put that into the chat, and Jen will be feeding those questions back into our conversation at the relevant stage. So don't hesitate to do that. So I'm going to now turn over to our speakers to go through their slides. First up will be John Shearer.
Thank you, Heather. I suppose I'm the proxy for the University Press contingent, and in particular for a kind of university press that I think is very vital to humanities scholarship. We all know that large places like Oxford and Cambridge, as well as high prestige presses like Harvard, Yale, and Princeton cast a really long shadow on the university press landscape. There are probably at least 30 or so presses the size of University of North Carolina, and even more, maybe another 50 or so that are just a notch or so smaller than that are generating thousands of new humanities monographs. So a very potent and important part of the humanities publishing landscape. That said, North Carolina is a little unusual in a couple of ways. One, we own a fulfillment business called Longleaf Services. It was started as a print fulfillment business, but it's become a broader publishing services platform to try and provide back-end scales for university presses, everything from pick, pack, and ship, but also doing things like sales representation, printing, EDP services, et cetera. And in recent years, we've also used Longleaf to be a platform for what I think are some pretty innovative grants. Most relevant to this conversation today is the Mellon-funded Sustainable History Monograph pilot. It's an open access pilot, but unlike most OA pilots, which I think are really just kind of funding experiments, ours is an intervention into workflows, and it's based on the assumption that OA dissemination is truly digital first. So we've created a standardized digital first workflow that requires presses to turn books over to Longleaf pretty far upstream after contract and peer review and acceptance, but before copy editing. Chloe, next slide, please. I mentioned all of that because despite the passion with which I know university presses have in their bones, we're really beholden to analog and print first workflows. As these bullets suggest, this is mainly because of legacy structures. We're built for print. We've always been built for print. And the degree to which we pivoted to digital is almost literally as a footnote to the print process. We take the print ready PDF and create an ebook at that stage. And many would argue that there's a business case for focusing on print. It's by far where most of our revenue comes from. So why shouldn't most of our investments be in print format creation? The fine line we're trying to walk with our Shrimp project, as well as just things that we're doing at Longleaf and UNC Press in general, is how can you still be a good publisher of high quality physical editions, but at the same time embrace the realities that even though most revenue is from print, discoverability and engagement are all in digital forms. In other words, you're not going to generate print activity if you're not a great digital publisher. I hope that's enough to kickstart some of our conversations, and I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, John. That's perfect to set the stage. And now we'll turn over to Martin.
Thank you. So my name is Martin Eve. I'm a literary studies scholar based at the University of London, so primarily one of those consumers and producers of monographs that we've been touching on. I'm also a disabled academic, so over the past 18 months of the pandemic, I've felt acutely the shutdown and the access restrictions that have been placed upon humanities research when we do not have open access to monographs. Of the 9 monographs that I've written, 8 of them are open access already, and I've invested substantial part of my career in working towards open access for monographs, believing that this carries with it great potential. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what I'm doing at the moment with respect to this on the COPIM project and the Opening the Future initiative. I'll have next slide, please. So John's already mentioned that discoverability is always digital in the contemporary book era. I'm not sure that's quite how my workflow was working before the pandemic, where I would find myself in the British Library with a stack of 10 books, scouring their bibliographies and intersecting them to find out what was at the center of a field by looking at those bibliographic convergence points. But he's got a much better point, which is that actually it remains incredibly difficult still to find monographs and to know that your literature search has been comprehensive in the current moment. I still find myself at very late stages in projects only stumbling across books by word of mouth recommendations rather than by any kind of knowledge and certainty that I've found my way through the labyrinth of obtuse titles that humanities scholars pick for their books. And so I felt for some time that there must be a better way of doing this, and open access to monographs is one way that we do that. We're at a really crucial juncture point, I feel, where much of the natural sciences is switching over to an open access model, while much of the humanities continues to dig its heels into the ground. And we're going to reach a point soon where it's very easy for the natural sciences to justify what they do because their visibility is enormous, while what we do in the humanities becomes less and less visible, less and less relevant, and more defunded. And so as part of the remedies to this, I'm working on the COPIM project, which is a Research England and Arcadia funded project to put in place the missing parts of the open access book infrastructure. So we've developed a metadata dissemination system called TOTE that specializes in dissemination of metadata for open access titles. So it's got open access at its core rather than working through those conventional metadata channels that work through aggregators and that are designed for a print ecology of sales, for instance. We also have a pilot program to transition existing university presses to open access business models. So the Opening the Future project that I designed and run works with the Central European University Press and Liverpool University Press, and essentially sells a subscription to their backlist content in order to ensure that the front list every year is made openly accessible. And they have enough content at those presses to be able to sustain that scheme for 30 years. So that seems a viable way of opening the future. And last but not least, we're developing a collective platform called the Open Book Collective for these types of new revenue experiments, these new types of model. I don't want to call them experiments anymore because they're becoming more and more mainstream. The new models for financing open access books, we're developing a centralized platform to host those and to help make them legible to libraries as that landscape becomes more and more complex. So thank you very much. I'll stop there. I hope that was a good briefing. I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. And Sarah.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sarah Lynch, the Assistant Publisher for Academic Books at the IET. We publish books in engineering, technology, and applied sciences in print and electronic formats, selling ebooks by collection, individual books, and by chapter. IET academic books address various traditional engineering fields, plus emerging and cross-disciplinary topics. The aim is that they reflect the role of engineering in solving societal challenges, proposing interdisciplinary solutions to complex problems, and in exploring the scientific principles that underpin current and future technologies. But the IET is a charitable institution, so while our books program operates much like a conventional publishing business, the surplus we make is fed back into the engineering community in various ways through the wider organization. I'm delighted to be participating in this session, but I'll say that at first I was unsure what to make of the theme. What about books? It's broad, and the challenge was not so much finding something to say as focusing it down to a manageable level. So with that in mind, I'm going to try to offer some answers to this question on 3 different levels, depending on the direction that the conversation and the questions take. Firstly, to answer the question, what about books in the broadest sense, I could pass on some information about books that a cross-section of the engineering research community has shared with us via a survey, which helps to show how books fit into the scholarly ecosystem. Secondly, I could give some insights into one of the things that especially excites me about working with books at the IET, and particularly thinking about discoverability and the opportunities that working with our in-house indexing system brings to our publishing workflow. Thirdly, I thought that a conversation on books and discoverability would be incomplete without touching on metadata. And I appreciate that this is a topic that could fill a 45-minute session in itself and then some, and also that of everyone here, I'm very much not the person qualified to give an in-depth view. But there are some ways in which we've adapted our workflows around our metadata needs that might be of interest. So thank you for having me here, and I hope that I can share some useful insights as the conversation unfolds.
Thanks so much. So Chloe, if we can just switch to the speaker view. Thank you for the stage setting. I too think the title is very broad, and I think in our planning calls, hopefully the story arc that we've settled on will help to focus the conversation. I should say we really wanted to have subject diversity represented today. So not just humanities, but also the sciences and interdisciplinary as well. We wanted to make sure that we covered, as John mentioned, both print and digital, and all of those new models as well, and including OA as well as subscription. I also think that this session flows very nicely from the accessibility session that happened earlier. I took a lot of notes about things that I thought we could continue to include in the conversation here. So thanks for the folks who put together that session as well. So kicking off and thinking about the earliest editorial stages. Some of the questions and conversations that happen between editors and authors around making sure that the work that will be put under contract will be discoverable, accessible, and more. Who would like to kind of kick off with some of the key factors that come up at that stage?
So I suppose one of the strangest things for me about the monograph Ecology in the Humanities, and I'm conscious we have subject diversity here, is the extent to which acquisitions editors still play such a crucial role in bringing a title to contract. Now I say that kind of astonishes me. It astonishes me because it seems a strange thing for us to be doing in the 21st century, but I also know that many colleagues place huge value upon that. But there's also this very odd industry arising around the concept of the acquisitions editor. So there's a prominent book being marketed at the moment that is all about how to write your book proposal and how to schmooze basically the acquisitions editor to get your book taken on. And I guess for me, the question is, what is the role of the acquisitions editor going forward from this point? We know that the university press sector is under increasing financial pressure the whole way through the system. We know that at the larger and more prominent university presses, the acquisitions editorial team are taking up an enormous chunk of the budget. And I think that we're going to see increasing pressure from funders and other more scientifically minded people to ask whether the acquisitions editor is really a valid filter in this process. Most stuff goes on to be published at some press or another. But if you're getting 6 rejections from acquisitions editors before you go to the press where this is accepted, is that something that really makes a very strong filtering process? Is it something that adds value to what we're doing? Or is it really a marketing and coherence issue for the press itself, which has discoverability implications? Of course, if you know that a press specializes in a subject area, then the acquisitions editor shaping that field might be something that helps you to find titles. But I guess I just wanted to put out there that kind of provocation. What's the role going forward for the acquisitions editor when we don't have that going on so much in the journal space anymore? And I think we're going to see it less and less in an ever more stretched books environment.
Martin, if I could just pop in some interesting comments from the chat saying that we should not undervalue the role of acquisitions editors in STM book publishing. So just throwing that out there as a point of conversation.
Yeah, Sarah, do you want to pick up on that?
Yes, please. So firstly, I think it shows quite dramatically the difference between humanities and STEM academic publishing, because certainly I do still do some book commissioning, and if anyone is schmoozing, I am schmoozing rather than being schmoozed. So I suppose I think that maybe that is a key difference where in the sciences the journal article tends to be more the vehicle for raw research, and in books it's more a case of going out to people and saying, okay, we think you're the person who's in the right place to bring together something on the trends in this field to help make those accessible and to help identify them maybe in a way that is not so easy to do from the kind of the sea of journal articles that are out there that are publishing the raw research. And so the role of the acquisitions editor is about identifying not only the topic, but the person who is going to come and help to do that.
Yeah, John?
Yeah, so this may be one of the places where it'll be interesting to make a distinction between journal and book publishing more than STEM versus HSS. To me, the value proposition when we're trying to sell something in book publishing is not so much I want to get $30 out of somebody's wallet to sell a book, but it's the time commitment that they're going to spend reading the book. So I'm trying to convince somebody that they're giving me 15 to 20 hours to read this book is worth it. And I think that is an editorial intervention. I think that, a journal article, people can just kind of like, I'm going to just take the time to read a journal article, and I may regret having read it, but I'm not going to regret it to the degree of like 15 hours of regret. And so to me, I think that the role that an editor plays to make sure that something is justifiable of 60, 90, 100,000 words, and is successfully integrating in the peer review process as well, which is a key thing that our acquisition editors do, is a vital thing for long form scholarship. There's just nothing makes a reader more unhappy to have committed. They just stop reading. So you actually lose the reader. So I actually think it's the fact that it's long form and that is kind of a different type of editorial intervention than a journal article. I just on your kind of just pivoting to your question, I do think one of the dangers, and I was just dealing with this morning with our authors, is this kind of cuteness that a lot of authors want to have in book titles and even chapter titles. And there's this there's a real problem to Martin's point about, sometimes you'll literally like see a title and a subtitle of book and still not know what the book is about. And it's usually because we've tried to be too clever as publishers to like do a pun or something that we think is eye-catching, but in fact has nothing to do with the book. So, one of the advice I give to authors is when you're writing, you actually should be kind of indexing as you're writing, like, thinking about what the key terms are in each chapter, so that when you are ready, when your publisher hopefully asks you for chapter level metadata and keywords, that you actually have that ready to go and you're not starting from scratch. So to be thinking about discoverability and clarity the whole time that you're actually writing, not doing that as kind of like a exercise at the end.
So as a person who started as a book acquisitions editor, this is a topic that really resonates with me, and the degree to which it's a relationship business, right? Regardless of maybe the content type or the subject area. I think it might be interesting, kind of looping, to the end, because these authors are researchers themselves and the kinds of things that they're thinking about when they are selecting a press. Can we jump to a couple of your slides, Sarah? Chloe, I think the last two slides that Sarah has talk about the researcher responses to the survey. Yeah, slides 9 and 10 there. If you could just maybe talk about when we're working with authors who may think about how this is going to happen for them further down the line, what are some of the key issues that come up for them?
Okay, so these data slides show the results of a survey that the IUT carried out earlier this year on research workflows, looking at how our different products, services, and solutions fit into engineering research. And to give an idea of the scope, we had over 400 respondents from 60 countries and 30 science, technology, and engineering disciplines, including physics, electrical and electronics engineers, computers and control, and mechanical and production engineering. All worked in research, but at various levels of seniority, from early career researchers who completed their PhDs less than a year ago, through to 20 years plus. And we asked about the role of different types of content and knowledge solutions in the research process. And we found that researchers ranked books as secondary in importance only to peer-reviewed articles, and ranking ahead of preprints, data repositories, patents, and social media in their work. 33.5% said that books were extremely important to the research process, and a further 37% said that they were somewhat important. Respondents reported that books perform the dual function of advancing a career through publication and also as a daily resource for knowledge exchange. We invited comments, and researchers particularly identified ebooks as a time-saving resource integrated into literature discovery journeys and able to be consumed remotely. So I hope this gives some context to the role and value of books in the engineering research ecosystem. These slides are obviously available for reference. I understand they'll be available to you afterwards.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And so if we can go back to the gallery view, given Chloe her workout. One of the things that resonated so strongly with me from the previous accessibility session, was metadata creation. And it occurs to me that if there is, for example, alt image metadata created, that makes images within the works all that more discoverable too. So can we talk about some of those parts of the workflow, which roles at the press, touch these processes, what John mentioned, some of the legacy practices that still impact the workflow, but what links and enrichments and things come into this creation and formatting stage, and maybe John, given the role that UNC Press has with Longleaf, maybe you could kick us off, and then and we'll go to then Martin and Sarah.
Sure. I mean, there's no doubt that it is a challenge and it's an imperative for presses to be focused on accessibility. I guess when I think about it, when we create a codex, we are creating the format that people are going to use to interact with the book. But we, in general, most presses, certainly presses my size, don't create the platform on which a book will be digitally discovered and read. And so and this is going to sound like I'm punting because I kind of am, I feel like it is up to the platform providers to build the accessibility tools and then to tell publishers what it is that we need to do. So I don't think I can develop at UNC Press the tool that helps, that has alt text and preserves that. But if somebody tells me this is what you need to do at UNC Press or at Longleaf on behalf of our partners, like we will absolutely do that. And so to me, it gets to this question about who is, this is the same thing that comes when it comes to archiving. Like, are suddenly presses responsible for archiving? Like, I kind of think not. I kind of think we are at the front end of the stage, and then that we really need to rely on the platforms that the users use. And then again, tell us what you need and then put the burden on us to do it. It would also be nice if all the platform providers needed sort of the same thing, and so that we're not producing 16 different push outs through Onyx of alt text and things like that. So it's kind of a punt to say that the platform should tell us what they need and then we'll respond to it.
Thanks. Martin, maybe you could weigh in. I know that you're talking to presses that are a variety of different sources and sizes and have differing levels of resources and technical and staff available to them, and that this may be an issue.
I think John's right that there's an issue of standardization here, and the XML formats that have been developed for coding book formats like bits, for instance, is not great on specifying precisely how you should use the standard itself in a regularized way. So the journal equivalent, JATS, we got to the point with that where we needed a working group called JATS for reuse to decide how we were supposed to use something that was already standardized so that we could have accessible content so that it would work. And I don't think the same work has been done for the standardization of book production yet, which really has people just doing what they can within their own spaces to create accessible content. I think also, though, we've got this very strange environment, hybrid crossover with the physical book still very much valued, present, and part of what we're doing. We didn't call this session long form scholarship. We called it the book, which has that materiality to it and really is harking back to a previous era of production, and we still value that as the gold standard. I don't know how long that will persist. I suspect a very long time. I found out recently that the PDF format, when it was first proposed, was actually Adobe's board of directors attempted to cancel the development of PDF because at that point they thought nobody would want to share paginated content between computer systems. So this death of the book has been predicted as long as we've been able to replicate content between systems, but pagination and the random and sequential access of the codex still remain the most valued aspects of that long form scholarship. So from my perspective, that's not going away. And that's great because for some users with accessibility needs, a physical codex is a brilliant device that gives them all they need. Other users, though, are going to need audio-assisted interaction with digital forms. And the PDF paginated version is really not very good at doing that. It doesn't work well with screen readers if you have, say, strange flow around an image. For other users, they're going to want a digitally paginated version. And I just think we're going to need diversity of outputs. We're going to need diversity of formats. But John's also right that we need to standardize the inputs and have a separate layer that basically will produce the different versions that are required by different people's accessibility needs.
And just while we have Martin on the line here, I do see some questions for you in the chat here. One question that's really interesting is, curious about your model opening up the future in which you sell backlist to sponsor OA frontlist. Do you not fear interest in backlist will decline further up in the future, leading to a decline in OA revenue? And then what do you do with book titles that you don't have enough revenue for to publish OA? Will you publish these? Will you not publish them non-OA? What will happen there?
So yeah, sorry, slight tangential swerve from where we were, I guess, but this is again another difference between journal and book markets, that we know that there are much longer usage half-lives on books and the back content. We also know, I've just been talking about format diversity, that actually libraries that have had print copies of an entire press's backlist this year have suddenly wished they had the digital version available. And there's been a whole new market for access to the digital titles because their researchers were suddenly locked down and locked out of the physical editions in the libraries. So we see quite a lot of interest in the backlist, but we've also had queries about whether there might be a front list version of this where you're selling a subscription to the front list, whether it's OA or not for some libraries that value their collection growth. At the moment, though, we're doing pretty well on sourcing people who are interested enough in that backlist content. I can't say whether that will last, but it's our hope that it will. But it's also our hope that people evolve their understanding in collections budgets at libraries to think about funding presses to continue their operations within specific disciplinary subfields and to publish the content on the front list open access. So really the backlist is a hook to get in the conventional collections librarians and their budgets and to say, great, well, you thought you were coming here to subscribe to the backlist content. When you actually did with that money was you funded the front list to be OA, and that was better for everyone. And I hope that this can lead to a sort of change in the ecology of how that purchasing is going through. I can't remember what the second question was, but I'm conscious I'm speaking a lot. So I'm happy to take that off list or to carry on that discussion elsewhere.
Yeah, if we can turn to Sarah, there's quite a diversity, of subject areas and press models, but within the IET, even though there's a wide range of things that you're publishing in according to the survey, what is it easier within that context to settle on certain metadata schemas? What are the kinds of challenges that come up in the production side?
Okay, so yeah, this is something that's kind of close to my heart, and one of the most exciting things that I think we do with books at the IET in some ways, aside from the content itself. And it was John's point, the book publishing is still in some ways tied to a print workflow that really sparked this train of thought, because I do agree with him in many respects that this is the case. But I wanted to talk about one way in which we've started to change things up in that respect. And one of the unique things that we do for our books at the IET in terms of discoverability is indexing them in InSpec at the whole book and the chapter level. So our InSpec records are created through the combined use of AI and human subject specialist indexes. And indexing our books in InSpec is part of our publishing workflow, and I think that's really important. So no ebook is published until it has been indexed, and no print book either. And the InSpec keywords then inform and enrich our Onyx feed, supporting the discoverability of our books even outside the InSpec database. But within InSpec, our books are indexed not just by keywords and topics, although we do that, of course, but by a wide range of criteria that can be converted into search terms and filters. So, for example, we index by treatments. Is the content experimental, theoretical, or review, or a literature survey, or a market report? We use numerical indexing, so you can search, for example, by device frequency or semiconductor bandwidth. We tend to think of research databases in terms of journals, or at least I did, where they're undoubtedly very valuable, but books can be part of that symbiotic relationship as well. And also, I wanted to say, I think that research databases often focus on tracking research trends in a particular field by looking at what's popular or who's prolific or which articles are highly cited. And that's valuable stuff. I use these tools myself in my own work. But it's one way of using them. And they're also a way to track down the specific and maybe the obscure or less well-recognized article or chapter. And maybe sometimes that's those discoveries that can spark a new or different train of thought. And I was kind of somewhat inspired in this thought process by Martin describing his kind of adventures in the stacks and in the library. And I was thinking, okay, well, yes, while that's frustrating, maybe sometimes it's that kind of serendipitous moment where you find something a little bit unusual. And how do we replicate that in the electronic world?
Yeah, I want to touch upon Martin, in the business model section. You mentioned, we're looking at print sales as well as digital, and I know we had some conversations during our planning process about the concerns that publishers have about digital sales cannibalizing print sales, and how that impacts the variety of business models. John, I know that there are some financial models in place around some of the open monograph programs, like the tome towards an open monograph ecosystem and the SHIMP Sustainable History Monograph project you mentioned. You've got some thoughts on what we really need to consider in the cost process when we're doing a digital edition as well. Maybe you can share those.
Yeah, well, I'd say that there's two things. One is nobody knows what happens to print when digital is open. So anybody who tells you confidently that it cannibalizes or enhances sales, they don't know, because nobody has really studied this systematically. We actually have a grant proposal out in front of a funder to try and do a study of this, because we need to kind of end the speculation and get some data. So let's stipulate that nobody really knows. And I think you can make an argument that both are conceivable. And I think it's kind of based on the spectrum of specialization. So if you have a monograph where your intention was to sell 400 copies, my theory is that if you actually make it open, you might sell 600 or 800 copies, because you've enhanced discoverability and engagement and created a set of stages where someone's going to become a print customer because you made it highly discoverable. On the other hand, if you had a kind of what we would call crossover monograph that you hope would sell 2,000 to 3,000 copies, I could see there being some cannibalization, because people who might have bought it kind of on that tail end might have downloaded a free copy instead. The thing about subsidies is, and tome subsidies, I think, are around $15,000. Knowledge Unlatched have been approaching 5 figures in the dollar sphere. And the thing that's always confused me about subsidies is people tend to be kind of unclear about what the intent of the subsidy is. And so I think Tome has kind of argued like the subsidy is to help a press because publishing monographs is really hard, and $15,000 makes it easier, which is a completely clear and true statement. But the question I have is, what is the financial risk to a press to making a book open digitally. And I can do it very briefly. Our average income on a monograph is $18,000 at UNC Press for a specialized monograph, and 10 to 15% of that is digital. So somewhere like around maybe $2,000 is, and so if you gave me a subsidy for $2,000 to replace my lost digital income, then you're just asking the question, what happens to print? Does print go up or down? So we need to answer that question. But if you give me $15,000 on a book where I was intending to get $18,000, like we close the press and go to the bar and have a cocktail because it's a celebration, because those checks are a windfall. So I'm grateful for them, and we need them to support other types of things we do. But I wish there was a little more clarity about what some of these subsidies were intended to do.
Great. And there's a follow-on question from Julia in the chat. Martin, could you quickly just mention some of the other models other than the subsidy model that John's gone into?
Yeah, I mean, the question in the chat is about what's the impact of the revenue loss for backlists in OA native models, and are there models outside of subsidies to recoup that? And I think, again, that's something that several studies have tried to look at. So OAPEN NL and OAPEN UK tried over a multi-year period to model what the impact was when you had these. They tried to do matched pairs where you had, a print version with digital versions available for sale versus a print version that also had an OA edition, and trying to match them up. And it proves very difficult to do a study that works out in this case. And I wish John a lot of luck in designing his study and the statistical models that will convince people of the results when you get them. But I think it varies hugely what presses are asking for at the moment in terms of the subsidies for OA books, and that isn't helping people to understand what they're for. So huge diversity between Cambridge University presses ask, Ubiquity presses ask, open book publishers ask. Open book publishers, for instance, have published a lot of data on where they spend the subsidy and what their production costs are, trying to make that transparent. But again, we come back to this issue of different presses having very different cost structures. Open book publishers, a born OA digital publisher of open access monographs, does not have an acquisitions department with acquisitions editors, whereas Stanford University Press has a whole division devoted to it. And so is it really comparing apples with oranges when you look at different presses, even if you're looking at their OA and their backlist and what that depletion does? This is all the kind of way, Julia, of talking around your question, saying that I don't actually know what the impact is of that revenue loss at the moment on the long tail. There's also the question of serendipitous titles that take off. I've heard presses tell me that actually that doesn't happen very often, and they're actually quite good at spotting the ones that are going to be the runaway successes. But on the other hand, it does from time to time happen that a title develops an afterlife that wasn't expected, and we simply don't know what that means at the moment. But no press would have been banking on that in their financial planning anyway. So that was just, a bit of good luck and the cocktail party that John was talking about anyway. So I think it'd be great if John can get that study to work, but we really just don't know at the moment what the impact is on those runaway titles and in general, the backlist as a sustainability mechanism for presses in a born OA world.
Great. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I do want to make sure that we can kind of touch upon that impact area of the flow, the readers, accessing titles. I know that John mentioned, or maybe it was Martin mentioned, publishers that didn't necessarily have digital versions of their book move very quickly at the outset of the pandemic. Libraries changed their behaviors in terms of the types of offerings they were spending on, given that the physical, buildings were closed. When we're looking at demonstrations of impact, whether that's metrics, whether that is just a wider geographical diversity amongst readership. Sarah, what are some of the things that the IET looks at to gauge whether the program is meeting that impact metric?
I'm not sure that I would be the right person to answer that question, if I'm honest, Heather. I suppose if you're asking questions around usage, then that is something that we do report on in terms of our electronic book collections and always have, but I don't have data at my fingertips to share with you. So maybe that's a question for me to pass on.
Okay. John?
I mean, it's so tricky because we talk with the invention of digital formats, we started talking about impact almost right away. And it was on the assumption that we understood what impact was in analog ways. And so, you know, I ship a physical book to a wholesaler like Ingram or Baker and Taylor, and then I literally don't know what happens to it. It could go to Amazon, it could go to a library, it could go to a consumer, it could go to a bookstore. So, but I call it a sale, and so we pat ourselves on the back. So, you know, we need to start with the idea like we've never understood impact, and so let's not hold the digital space up to a higher one. But now that we've been doing digital for long enough, we do see, you know, we see trends over time. So you can kind of compare digital to digital. And the shocking thing that happened in the last 18 months was during the early stages of the pandemic, a lot of our vendors like Project Muse and Books at JSTOR and ProQuest and EBSCO came to us and said, would you open your collections during the pandemic? And we saw both exponential, like they had to redraw the charts. They had to expand the size of the charts because they did usage went up by factors of 10, and then print sales exploded at the same time. So another very interesting project for somebody to take on someday is to try and understand what that was about. So what we know is when books are widely available, discoverable, they get used more. I don't think anybody would argue that. And so then you have to kind of make a distinction like, well, are we in the business of usage and impact, or are we in the business of selling enough stuff to fund what it is we're trying to do? And that's a conversation for another panel.
Mm-hmm. Martin?
I guess for many years, the books that have been central to a field and have made an impact, it hasn't really mattered whether they're open access or not. Some books, for reasons we don't quite understand, become central tenets of academic disciplines. Others, they might be very decent books, but they never have that. And there are also books that are very niche in their scope and are never designed to have field-wide changing impact. They are just communicating findings about some very niche topics, and that's valid too. I suppose I go with what John said, though, that if your book is openly accessible and broadly readable, there are new audiences as well who would never have been involved in a scholarly discussion before. As we start to try to think about a more globally equitable world, one of the impacts we might have is how many people outside of your niche circle are able to get hold of your book and get back to you and participate in a scholarly dialogue who weren't before within a more traditional purchasing ecology. There's been a lot of talk about programs of decolonizing the curriculum and thinking about the equity structures in our universities. I think we're only really at the beginning of thinking about what it means for our publishing structures to also be more inclusive and not just an export culture from the global north to the global south, but really making it a bi-directional ecology of publishing and reception and accessibility. And perhaps that's a new type of metric of impact that really hasn't yet come to the fore, but that should be in our thinking about what a proper global research ecology looks like.
Great. Just wanted to check in with Jennifer. Have we missed anything in the chat? You've been doing a great job at helping us feed things into the conversation.
I just encourage everyone to go look at the chat if they haven't. There's some great conversation that's happening there, and our speakers are answering questions as they go. So I guess there's just one general question that would be great for the whole group to, as we work to tie things up. When we speak of open futures, is there any way we can envision a sustainable open scholarship model?
I would say there has to be, right? Martin, I know you've got thoughts on that.
I come from the UK university system, which quite frankly is being squeezed progressively on a funding basis by our government day after day. We have redundancies at many institutions in the UK already, some voluntary, some compulsory. Whether we can sustain a publishing program on top of a research ecology that is under such pressure is, an interesting question. And it's going to put more and more pressure, I think, on the publishing industry as the university sector here comes under more pressure. That's what we've seen in the journal space. Why should Elsevier be making its 37% profit margins when researchers are losing their jobs? That hasn't really, hit so hard in the humanities sector because people are more sympathetic to the mission of university presses and because there aren't really those behemoths making such incursions. But if Springer Nature starts eating up the entirety of the budget of University of California system with a transformative deal for books and open access publishing, do we start to see similar questions being asked of the book publishing sector? It could be coming to a town near you soon if you're not careful. So, I think sustainability means different things for different actors within a system. But what we really need is a symbiotic relationship and having mission-driven presses that are not parasitical upon the funds of universities that are really in dire straits already and are working with them to publish scholarship seems to me the only way we're going to get through this alive together at the moment. So sorry for a bit of pessimism there, but yeah.
Well, thank you. I think that was, I think it ended on a nice note about the mission-driven organizations. And I want to thank Sarah and John and also Martin with the perspectives that they've brought today. And I hope that some of this conversation might continue in the networking session. And I will hand over, thank everyone again, and hand over to Chloe in case there's any last words before we break.
But thank you again to all of our presenters. Great job.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.